Good morning and good afternoon from Washington, D.C. I'm Lauren Reese, and together with my colleagues in the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and our partners at USAID, it's my privilege to welcome you to this discussion on what better looks like when it comes to the extraction and production of critical minerals. For those of you joining the Wilson Center for the first time, a quick word about where you're tuning into. The Wilson Center is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., mandated by the U.S. Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. The center is home to about 15 programs that focus on different regions or topics, including our Brazil, Canada, Mexico, and Polar Institutes, as well as our Latin American and Global Europe programs, all of which are co-sponsoring today's event. The Environmental Change and Security Program, or ECSP, works to connect issues at the intersection of environment, climate, health, and security to foreign policy and international development. Climate change and responses to it are reshaping our world, everything from where we live to how we transport people and commodities to how and where we produce energy. Ensuring that our responses to climate change lay the groundwork for a more just and equitable future, that no one is left behind in the global energy transition, is a core focus of ECSP. We began looking at the unintended security consequences of climate responses, or what we call backdraft, more than a decade ago. In a 2010 event chaired by Jeff DeBelco, Stacy Vanderveer and Cleo Pascal spoke about the dependence of renewable energy technologies on critical minerals, making the point that the extraction of these minerals primarily takes place in vulnerable communities around the world where labor rights and environmental protection is lacking. Cleo noted that China had been very active in securing minerals for a very long time, centering it as a part of their general strategic security, compared to the US, which was primarily focused on mineral supplies from a commercial context. She warned that the difference between the strategic perspectives of the US and China was creating a very uneven playing field. Today, 12 years later, the playing field is still uneven, and momentum is only building for a global energy transition, a critical step forward in our efforts to avoid the worst climate scenarios. But with the passage of recent legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides billions of dollars in tax incentives for renewable energy and commits to increasing the US supply of critical minerals, there's a risk that in our modern day mineral rush, without meaningful efforts to do better in the mining sector, there will be casualties. Not mining is not an option. So the question becomes, how do we do better? In June, we hosted a discussion on how the projected increase in mineral demand could influence markets, supply chains, and geopolitical competition. Panelists highlighted the ongoing risks posed by the mining sector in countries like the DRC and China's outsized influence in the supply chain. If you didn't have an opportunity to tune into that June 1st discussion, you can find it on the Wilson Center website. Today, we're going to focus less on the hurdles and more on how we can clear them. We had over 750 RSVPs for this event. I take that as a strong indication of the growing awareness of both the centrality of critical minerals to the energy transition and the need to do better. I hope that those of you tuning in will share your questions for the panelists via the chat box that you can find below the streaming video. So let's get to it. In the Moderators Chair today, we have the Honorable Sharon Burke. ECSP is really lucky to be working closely with Sharon on this topic. She's been a leading thinker on resource security issues for nearly 3 decades, including in senior US government positions in the State Department and the Pentagon, where she served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy. Today, she is the president of Ecospherics, a research and advisory organization, and a global fellow with the Wilson Center. Before I pass the reins over to Sharon, though, I have the privilege of introducing our opening speaker, Kimberly Thompson. Kim is a career Foreign Service Environment Officer who specializes on the links between natural resources and conflict, with a focus on mining. A senior advisor on these issues at USAID, she also serves as the industry lead for mining at the agency. In their recent report on green energy minerals, USAID noted that 16 of the minerals most important for the renewable energy transition, for the renewable energy technologies, are mined in 70 countries where USAID has a presence, making the agency a valuable partner in ensuring that a mining boom can foster sustainable growth and employment and be managed in ways that mitigate the environmental, social, and governance risks so often associated with extractives. Kim is a real leader on this issue at USAID, and we're so pleased to be partnering with her on this event. Kim, over to you.
Thanks for that introduction, Lauren. And I wanted to start out by saying thank you to you, Lauren, and to Sharon especially, and everyone else at the Wilson Center that's worked so hard to put together this amazing group of panelists from the private sector, government, and civil society, to discuss how we can create responsible supply chains for critical minerals. Through this and other panels that the Wilson Center has organized, the Wilson Center really has emerged as a leader in advancing the global dialogue around critical minerals. As the world is racing to address the climate crisis and initiate, large-scale transitions to renewable and low-carbon energy sources, critical minerals are increasingly becoming the backbone of our global economy. And USAID, for our part, is increasingly paying attention to the mining sector and looking to do our piece, because minerals are both essential to our ability to address climate change, and they also, as Lauren noted, have the potential to, if they're not managed well, to contribute to instability around the world by sparking or worsening conflicts, driving corruption and human rights abuses, or causing significant environmental damage. And the mining sector is never going to be perfect. It's a difficult industry, but we really can and we must do better. We must learn from our mistakes. We must draw lessons from the resource curses of the past. We must learn to empower and listen to local communities. We must learn to manage environmental and social risks and insulate the sector from corruption. In short, we need to learn to govern the sector better. And I wanted to highlight to this broader group here that USAID has developed a number of resources. Lauren actually mentioned one already, exploring the risks and opportunities associated with mining in the green energy transition. And those can be found just by searching on the internet for USAID mining and green energy. It should come up just with that search. And I also wanted to highlight USAID's Countering Transnational Corruption Grand Challenge. We have an inaugural activity under that Grand Challenge, which is going to focus on safeguarding mineral supply chains critical to the green energy transition from corruption. So more information on that can be found on USAID's website. And that brings me back to our event today. So USAID is really honored to be co-sponsoring this event today to advance the conversation around critical minerals. And importantly for today, focusing on some of the bright spots in a difficult sector to help create a roadmap for the future. So I'm very excited to explore, what better can concretely look like in the minerals sector, because better is what we all need to be striving for, whether we're donors, governments, civil society, or the private sector. So thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to a rich conversation. Over to you, Sharon.
Thanks so much, Kim, and thank you for getting us started, and also for all the work that you're doing in this space to make mining better, which is the topic of the day. So we're at a really interesting point in human history. The digital age economy, global economy that we all live in we were born forward to this point on a tide of fossil fuels throughout the industrial age. And that has come at great consequence environmentally to indigenous and local communities and to governance worldwide. So the question is now, as we make an energy transition and try to continue to improve the fortunes and the well-being of people around the world, how do we not walk down the same path that we've all trod throughout the industrial age? It's a very difficult question, a burning one, and everyone you're going to hear from today is trying to answer it and is taking a role in the answer from various points of view. And we're so lucky to have such a diverse group. I'm going to introduce all of our panelists quickly, and then we'll get right into it and let them talk to us directly. First, we're going to hear from Amy Boulanger, who is the Executive Director of the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or IRMA. And Amy, I'm dying to ask you how IRMA is doing with Ira and Bill, so we can get into that later. But in this position, she provides direct service to IRMA's multi-stakeholder leadership and manages IRMA's staff and consultant team. She's worked on mining issues for more than 20 years with substantial experience working directly with communities. And just so you know, now you have her official bio, but as the international community and the United States government, which we'll hear more from in just a moment, are trying to figure out how to set standards for environment, social, and governance in this space, IRMA is leading the way. So to have the top actor in this space, the top independent actor, is really a treat. So we'll hear from Amy first, and I'm glad she could join us. Next, we'll hear from Amaya Dia, who is joining us from PACT. After working for several years for diverse international NGOs and humanitarian organizations in both development and emergency contexts in Africa and the Caribbean, Amaya joined PACT in 2016. And PACT, if you don't know, is a really interesting international organization that's active in 40 countries, doing humanitarian work and development work directly with the people in these communities. So they have a lot of moral authority on the ground. So we're very delighted to have her here. And since joining PACT, she's become the Senior Protection Program Officer for PACT's Mine to Market initiative, which is a signature program that helps resource-dependent communities gain lasting benefit from mineral resources. So Amaya, thank you. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Next, we'll hear from Helena Matzah. So Helena is the Director of Energy Transformation in the Bureau of Energy Resources at the U.S. Department of State, where she leads strategic engagement on clean energy and power sector issues, including the department's multilateral efforts focused on securing clean energy supply chains. She's been at State for 9 years in various roles and developing and managing multi-million-dollar innovative initiatives related to energy, climate change, and environmental issues. And I can tell you that Helena is a very creative executive, and the fact that we have such interesting initiatives in this space for the US government, you're looking at the person who's generating that. So we're very fortunate to have her here today. And then we're going to hear from Christopher Smith. And I want to be clear that that is certainly not because he is the least amongst us. Chris is a formidable executive. Right now, he is Ford's Chief Government Affairs Officer, where he leads a global team that is constantly enhancing the company's expertise and influence in legislation and policy, vital to Ford's plan for growth and value creation. Rapidly evolving policy priorities include areas such as connectivity, electric vehicles, no secret there, and digital services that are intended to benefit customers, society, and the environment, among other stakeholders. Now, that's more about Ford than it is about him. But one of the reasons it's so great that Chris is with us here today is that we wanted to make sure we had in the conversation a company that's a major consumer of minerals and that is trying to do the right thing and do things differently. And I hope Amy won't mind if I say explicitly that it was Amy's suggestion that we include Ford in this, because it's such an interesting new shift to have a major consumer of minerals adopting these voluntary standards. So Chris, it's really important that you're with us here today. And you know, I could say so much more about Chris's background. As I said, he's been a important voice in the US government, in the private sector. Started out as a West Point graduate, which, you know, given my background in defense is certainly very important to me. So we're happy to have him here today. As you can see, this is a fabulous panel. And how we're going to do this is that I'm going to be posing questions to them. So we're going to make this more a conversational style. And all of you who have joined us online, you have the opportunity to ask questions. In the bottom of your streaming screen, you should see a box for asking questions. And we will certainly try to leave enough time for that. So with that, let's get right into it. So Amy, you're up. Tell me, so, you know, the theme of this event is what does better look like, but can you talk to us a little bit about, I mean, what does good look like in mining? You know, in exploration, development, extraction, there's a lot that goes into mining. What does good look like? What can good look like? Can there be good? Give us some truth here.
Well, thanks so much for that, Sharon, and others for having me. I mean, I'm going to say first, but I promise I'll answer your question that I'm going to take the cop out of it. Depends on who you ask, right? I'm in an Indigenous community pressed to the edge. or trying to protect what little cultural heritage is left, or a community living downstream of a tailings dam is going to have a different definition of what is good compared to end brands who are giving us the products that we use each day, or the mining companies who are striving to supply them with that. And so you've got this tension, first of all, of who is defining what is good or good enough. And that's the fear for a lot of people about the moment we start talking about good and not best, is that that good mark keeps coming down to meet this sort of demand of a society, that particularly industrialized societies who seem to never have enough, while we continue to have resource distribution crises, right, and inequities in the world. But I think that there's an effort right now, perhaps one that's never been paralleled when it comes to the mining sector, where we're moving to a place where those who are most directly affected and the end brands who are selling the products that society is asking for, in which many of us in industrialized societies are complicit in that demand, and the mining companies supplying them, are talking at a level to be hearing each other and looking at, could good be the same across, and what does it look like, and in fact that it must be. And to take that slip that you made there also, Sharon, but I agree with you, is what's better on the way to good, because we might not be, we're definitely not at good yet, and we're certainly not at best, but better on that journey on the way there is to start with increased transparency around the impacts of it. You know, many people, especially in wealthier parts of the world, don't know what industrial scale mining looks like. They don't know where the materials in their phone or their buildings or their cars come from. They don't know how hard it is to get those materials out of the ground and meet that need. And so it's time for more honest accounting that says it is incredibly destructive industry, and it's supplying materials that most of industrialized society uses every day. And so therefore, with that, you know, instead of claiming it's all 5-star and AAA and it all meets standards, is let's start with an honest awareness of where those impacts are and more transparent accounting of what's happening at mines, and then a measure toward working with the communities who live closest to that for the improvements that could be there, with a striving toward best. And we need to talk about best there. We're not going to get there, right? We need to have markets which really value that best definition, which is some of what Irma's work is to do.
Okay, it's a great point. And I probably will never forget it, just that good is in the eye of the beholder. But can you talk to us a little bit about Irma's role in defining what good, better, and best might look like?
Yeah, thanks for that. So my bosses are equally governing, and they come from affected communities, from NGOs, from labor unions, and then also purchasers like Ford, mining companies in the finance sector, working to craft a definition that's accountable globally for what is best practices. And so part of that is to lay out a measurement transparently of mines against that standard. So that's going to be audited. The audits are going to be publicly noticed so that a community can participate in it. And even that is part of best, is making sure that when we look at, are the suppliers to our end brands doing less harm, is have we asked the community that, have we asked the workers that? So we've really got a full accounting of those impacts, and then a detailed report on what that looks like. And then are we making sure we don't trade issues off of one another? Is that look comprehensive? So yes, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at every level in our production, but at the mine level, greenhouse gas emissions are not one of the greatest impacts that is being brought upon an environment and ecosystem there. It's impacts to water, it's impacts from waste, it's the human conflict that comes, whether that's indigenous rights or human rights around it. So can we make sure it's not worker health and safety or protecting air quality? Can we make sure it's not water or indigenous rights, but have a comprehensive look and then hold that against best? And of course, mines are complex and they're dynamic. They're going to have some strengths and other weaknesses, but it gives a base from which a community can have a conversation, and then that community can also be heard by end brands like Ford or BMW or the jewelry industry or wind tech companies like Microsoft and others, so that there's a more direct line between those most affected and those who can leverage the purchasing power for change.
So you've already hinted at this, but could you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges, the key challenges, because I'm sure there's no small amount of challenges to ensuring that you get responsible mining, and not just mining, but also processing, because of course, getting the raw ore out of the ground is only the beginning of a process. You have to process it. But also there's a lot of talk about recycling. That is also not without costs there. And also consuming. And, we're specifically interested in critical minerals, but this is true for minerals and materials across the supply chain. Could you talk to us about the key challenges and even the challenges that you face in trying to implement these standards?
Yeah, there are a few, and I'm sure if I thought of 3, then everyone here would think of 30 more. So I invite my fellow panelists to chime into others. But I mean, some is complex supply chains. You've got some which are increasingly quite short of mines selling directly to end brands now, but that's not been the way it was done for most of that history. So you have the difficulty if you're a purchaser of reaching back to do responsible sourcing, knowing who your sources are and what happens between mine processing and that end brand. So that increasing tracking and traceability is happening, but of course, we don't have to spend all the money on tracking and traceability if we can improve practices at every point in the chain by lifting all boats in it. I mean, we have the challenge that that existing mines don't change quickly. And if we want to create added value for improving even at existing mines, they're not going to all be perfect tomorrow. But if we say, look, can we take the existing mines where there are existing jobs and impacts and create value for improvement in those places, then we hone in on the places where we've already made the impacts rather than just breaking new ground for the more perfect mine of the future, although we're likely to need some of both. We have a century of industrial scale mining that hasn't valued best, that has valued getting materials out for the cheapest price to put it on the market. And so we're retooling our thinking. Fortunately, there's a ton of incredibly talented and innovative people who've been looking for this moment, who've come out with their mining engineering and geology degrees, who have been tooled to be thinking this, but they need the permission slip to invest that time and effort to for practices which might cost a bit more in the short term, but as we're already living in a climate stressed world, we need to make sure that our solutions here in extracting materials for energy transition don't do greater harm. And then I think the last thing I'd say is that, a voluntary initiative like IRMA is never going to replace the rule of law in government. We need to improve these laws, and a global standard like IRMA can be used as a template and a support to governments as they increase and improve the strength of their laws and the robustness of their legal structure. So it's not just opting into something voluntary, but really creating an expectation globally that this industry can follow.
Thank you, Amy. And just something, I want to give the other panelists a chance to weigh in. But something that it would be great to come back to you on too is the mining industry has a long history and not a necessarily a particularly good one. And I'm curious if you find partnerships with mining companies, and if you're finding that this is a new day, and are you finding cooperation there? So we'll come back to you on that. And that gives me a great opening to turn to Amaya Dia. Amaya, could you talk to us about local stakeholders when it comes to mining? Because I know that my understanding is that you and PAC do a lot of work there. And what are the different community level strategies that are available to ensure that critical minerals and the mining of them and the processing benefit the places where they're actually produced? Could you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yes, of course. Thanks a lot for the question. I personally think that local stakeholders, and when I'm talking about local stakeholders, I mean community members, local community organizations, local government structures are, I think that they're crucial partner in this. And I feel that too often they are maybe seen as a secondary stakeholder, and their views and opinions and concerns might not always be taken into account the way they should be. And this leads us to some situations where you have, for instance, mining licenses, mining concessions, which are being allocated at the national level with very little knowledge of what is happening on the ground. And what we're seeing in the DRC, and excuse me, but I'll be quoting a lot the DRC because we are working a lot in the DRC. It's really having those extremely large mining concessions, which are located extremely closely to households, in communities where, unfortunately, there's a lot of needs which are not necessarily attended to, which means that this can also lead to very grave human rights violations, including the issue of child labor in mining, for instance. And I'm going to be talking a bit also about this issue specifically, because this is one of the issues in which I am specialized. So all of this to say that, yes, it's extremely important that local stakeholders are involved in this dialogue. And I also feel that, to make sure that there exists a lot of community level strategies to mitigate those kind of risks, and also to ensure that the critical minerals provide tangible benefits. And when I'm talking about tangible benefits here, I'm thinking about, economic opportunities for local communities where mining is taking place. And concretely, I'm talking about sustainable jobs, sustainable livelihoods as well. I'm also talking about, being able to develop some of those much needed infrastructures, including educational infrastructures or health infrastructures, or, having, making sure that community has access to clean water to drink. And I also feel that, so there's a certain number of structures that exist. And for instance, in the DRC, most communities have what they call the local development committees, which are mainly composed of community leaders whose tasks are to identify those kind of issues in their communities and to try and find solution regarding, how to address those issues. And I'm extremely happy to work for PAC, because when we're turning to these kind of issues, we really try to engage all of the stakeholders to the supply chain. But for us, the main stakeholder really is the community. We really want to make sure that their voices are heard, that they are part of this dialogue, and that, we also want to make sure that this wealth which is created is also going to trickle down to them, which is often not the case, as as has already been noted. So for this, I'm going to give you a concrete example, taking from our Children Out of Mining program, which we've been implementing in the DRC for close to a decade. More specifically, we've been working in Kolwezi. Kolwezi is the mining hub there. This is really the heart of the copper cobalt belt in the DRC. And bear in mind that the DRC is producing about 60 to 70% of the cobalt, which is being produced worldwide. And about 15 to 20% of this cobalt is mined by artisanal and small-scale miners. And so basically, the issue of child labor in mining is a big issue, because there's about 35,000 children who are involved in mining activities, just mining cobalt. So we have started this program exclusively funded by private sector actors, including industry association or large tech companies. And so what we did is that in the different communities where we're implementing the project, we started what we call the neighborhood committees, which are really a subgroup of this local development committee that I was talking about. But this subgroup really focuses only on the issue of child labor in mining. And very early, they came to us and they told us that one of the main concerns for them was the high number of adolescent miners that were engaged in mining activities and that didn't have any alternative to mining. And they asked us to find a solution. And what we did is that we started this apprenticeship program, which is really using a community-based model. And what we're doing is that we're using local know-how to start 6 months apprenticeship in different trades, such as auto and motor mechanics, IT, welding, carpentry, hairdressing, tailoring, all of those different trades. And what we've seen now that we have trained several hundreds of those youth is that many of them are now business owners, micro businesses, but they're still, business owners. Many of them are also employed now by companies now that they are of working age, including mining companies, actually. And we've also seen some of them that were involved, for instance, in the COVID-19 prevention and mitigation effort that has been taking place over the past 2 years now, even more in the DRC. And for instance, our graduates in tailoring were making face masks. Those in welding were making hand washing station. And all of this was not only good for their own communities, but it was also good business for them. And I recall a couple of years ago when I was in Kolwezi, I met a young woman who had been one of our graduate apprentices, and she had been learning IT. And following her graduation, she was hired by a language institute as a secretary. And she was telling us how proud she was because a year before that, she was working at mining sites. And now she was a model for the community. She was a model for her siblings. She was a model for her friends. And she was extremely grateful about this opportunity that was given to her to change her life, but also to change the life of her community, of course. But in the same way, there's also a lot of mining companies that are doing a lot of great stuff as well, working hand in hand with those local development communities that I was talking about, and who are building schools and vocational training centers, who are also building, health infrastructures. So all of this just to say that, according to me, giving a voice to those communities really is the most important thing, because if we want to make sure that large mining operations have this kind of license to operate, communities need to be there, and the communities need to have been informed and to provide them with this informed consent. Thank you.
That's great, Amaya. And it sounds as though from what you're describing in Kolwezi that it's a model that works or can work. Is that fair to say? And do you think that this example of success where you've got the community benefiting and the mining companies participating in a dialogue with them, is that fair to say that's what's going on? And do you think that that can work for other places as well?
I'm not going to say that it's happening everywhere, of course, now, but what I'm saying is that, there are those structures that provide this opportunity. And I feel that it's extremely important to use them, because this is also why they were created. And again, to make sure that, as Aimé Boulanger was saying earlier on, there's no tensions and there's no conflicts, between local communities and the large LSM operators. To answer the second part of your question, yes, definitely, this can be replicated in other contexts. In the DRC, because the DRC is a huge country, which is large as a continent, and so there's different dynamics depending on where you are in the DRC, but it's also scalable in other countries. For instance, we have been implementing a similar model, because we can't, it's not a one size fits all, right? So we can't just take it from the DRC and just bam, put it in another country. But we've been doing this in Zambia, for instance. We're working in Zambia, again, with ASM communities on the issue of child labor in mining in communities which are mining copper. And we've also starting a new project in Madagascar, which is funded by USAID. And we're implementing similar strategies as well in communities which are mining mica, which is, again, different problem, but trying to make sure that, we can use a similar system.
Thank you. And I know you're actually, PACT is on the ground actually making this happen. So it's great to hear from the eyewitness how it can look. And, I was interested in, you talked about the mining companies as partners. And so that's a good segue to Christopher Smith. And Helena, we're coming to you next, so brace yourself. Chris, as I said at the outset, one of the reasons we were excited to have you on was that my understanding from Amy and her colleague Christy Bruckner is that Ford has begun incorporating IRMA's standards into its contracts with suppliers. So I think that's a fascinating development. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us about the bigger picture about the role of businesses and who source these materials for their technologies, and how the demand side of this business can help drive demand for green mineral production and the kinds of community engagement that Amaya was just talking about.
Hey, thanks so much, Sharon, for the question, and also for giving me the opportunity to be here with this group. I really appreciated Lauren's framing, kind of in the introduction, in that the observation that not mining simply is not an option. Like, these are things that we have to figure out how to do well. And it's also really encouraging to hear Amayo's depiction of some steps that are happening on the ground that give us some real practical examples of some steps that we can take in ways that we can ensure that these practices are handled well. You know, Sharon, as you mentioned in your kind of introduction, you know, I spent some time in government. I was the federal official for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, and that's as a former regulator, that's a big part of the perspective that I bring to these jobs. Processes that you must accomplish, but you have to accomplish well, and the consequence of not doing these things well. So that's part of the phrase. That's part of the ways that we think about, you know, the challenge of all industrial processes in the future, like the critical importance of getting these things right. As you mentioned, like in February of last year, Ford was the first American automaker to join IRMA, and this is clearly unambiguously a really important part of our emerging supply chain. It's hard to overstate how important the electric vehicle is going to be for the future of Ford and the future of transportation. That's one of the reasons I'm here at this company. We've not started on the fringes or on the margins. We started right at the middle of our portfolio. We've taken our most iconic brands, the Ford F-150, the best-selling vehicle for the last 44 years, the iconic Ford Mustang, and we've taken those critical assets for the company, and we're turning those into electric. So we're making an enormous investment in electric vehicles. We're investing over $50 billion in EVs and EV battery productions through 2026. We're building facilities throughout the United States. It's a critical part of our supply chain. One of the observations is that it's really important in terms of if you're looking at deep mid-century reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, you can't do it without addressing the transportation sector. So they're very important drivers to push us in that direction. And interestingly, like one of the things that I've really become very immersed in since I joined this company is just the engineering prowess that's now turned electric vehicles into very, very capable, desirable vehicles that are going to really push that transition. So, you know, it's fortuitous that we've now created, you know, we're now able to create vehicles that have performance that exceed their internal combustion engine counterparts, but also have the great benefit of zero tailpipe emissions. So that's going to drive us to a whole new set of considerations around supply chain. You know, accessing the lithium, the nickel, the cobalt, the graphite that we need in order to build these batteries. So, you know, our collaboration with entities like IRMA that helps create greater transparency across the board. We know that you know that in other regions outside the United States, particularly in China, there is a enormous, formidable head start that they have on not only battery technologies but also on mining and processing and refining. These facilities simply sit outside of the United States. So we're doing what we can to try to onshore some of this activity. And at the same time, to make sure that we are encouraging the right type of standards to level that playing field. We want to make sure that it's important as we take steps here in the United States to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, that we're not simply exporting all of the challenges around that to other parts of the world. So the last point I'll make is that the idea of critical minerals and rare earth elements and mining to the general public has historically been fairly abstract. I mean, if you talk to people about what these things are, there's not a lot of visibility. You know, when you attach these issues back to a brand like the Blue Oval, like Ford, in the future, we think there's going to be a greater degree of visibility. That's not something I'm predicting or I'm trying to create. It's just a matter of fact. It's important that we get these factors right. So electrification is going to be the key to the future transportation. And right at the middle of that is the ability to access and mine and refine these minerals that you need for these batteries in a way that's consistent with our larger values. And that's part of the reasons why in February we became the first of the American makers to join IRMA.
That's great. And I think for a company like Ford that's so big and has such global operations that sometimes it's difficult to know what's even in your supply chain. Is there any more you can tell us about how Ford is looking across your supply chain to sort of responsibly use critical minerals in your products?
Yeah, so supply chain is incredibly complex for a company like Ford. So if you look back to the history of Ford, the very start of automated processes and the creation of the transportation industry, Ford initially used to bring in its own sand that we used to make our own glass. That we used to make our own materials. This was the early days of the assembly line and Ford manufacturing. And over time, we've created a very, very complex industry of suppliers where we have tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers that make these things for us. We're responsible for assembling them into automobiles for the design and the manufacture and the distribution of automobiles. But many of those things we've outsourced to our tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. We're seeing now that one of the things that we've learned through the experience of COVID is that supply chain is probably more fragile than a lot of participants in the industry kind of realize. We see that with challenges with accessing microchips and semiconductors. We also see that with the importance of ensuring that we have access to a finite source of extracted materials and refining. So that's something that we're certainly paying a lot more attention to across the complex here, and it helps us shine a brighter light in making sure that the materials that we source are sourced in ways that are consistent with our company's values, and that we expect to be held accountable for that. We publish a corporate responsibility report every year, and indeed, there's I think a great deal of visibility on a brand like Ford, and it's an important part of our competitive advantage to do these things well.
That's great. I think that's a really important point, that it's the right thing to do, but it's also an advantage for your company to do it right. So good to hear that. And I'm going to come back to you later to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. So again, IRMA and IRA together. So we'll get there. But you said something that really set things up nicely for our next speaker, about the sourcing and about how you get resources. Of course, the United States is an area that, and North America more generally, is blessed with a lot of natural resources. And some of the emphasis on how to work across the challenges in critical minerals that we're seeing have focused on domestic mining and processing. But it will be a mistake for us to only look at home and to isolate our vision here. No question that we do have to look at our own resources and not just others, but the international partnerships and the other countries, and Amayel mentioned the DRC, there is no clean energy transition without the DRC. They are the resource for most of the world's cobalt. So this is a story that's told all over the world, that there are important resources everywhere, and that the only way to make a global energy transition is if we cooperate. So I'm really pleased to have Helena Matzah with us, because she has been the architect of that cooperation and what it can look like. So Helena, could you talk to us a little bit about the new initiative that you're spearheading, the Mineral Security Partnership, and how that fits in with US policy, and also the other initiative that I believe you also started, ERGI, and I forget what it stands for. So you'll have to also tell us that. Could you talk to us a little bit about what these initiatives are and mean to the US and where they're going?
Sure, happy to do so. And really have been heartened by this conversation so far. And just really, I think the panelists have done an amazing job of really both describing the complexity, but the imperative to get the EV battery supply chain right, and all the work that really goes into doing that. So maybe I'll just zoom out first, and then I'll jump into some of these initiatives. I think that one thing this administration has made really clear is that there is a true commitment to answer the mail on the political imperative of getting supply chains right, especially those that apply to our ability to meet our climate ambitions. I almost start all these talks off the same exact way. I had the opportunity to serve in the White House in the first days of this administration before returning to my post at the State Department. And in our first week, we put forward 2 executive orders, one on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, and one on securing America's supply chains. And there's no issue that's more at the center of that work than what we're talking about here, which is the sustainable sourcing of the critical mineral inputs that go into our clean tech future. And the US government has taken many approaches, and Kim laid out some of our really longstanding work at USAID. The State Department's been tackling this issue really from 2 main camps. One, on the work that we can do to enable the environment for capacity development that supports ESG in mineral producing countries around the world. And that is really what the work of the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, ERGI, has been doing for several years since we launched in 2018. That work has brought over $30 million to countries all around the world, whether that's work we're doing in Argentina or Uganda. We just signed an MOU with the DRC, and I just returned from a trip there myself just 2 weeks ago, working on these issues directly with the government and other industry stakeholders. And this work is really important. And one element that I think is really pertinent to this conversation is something that we developed with our partners initially, which include the governments of Canada, Australia, Botswana, and Peru, called the ERGI Toolkit. And what the ERGI Toolkit does is it's an online tool that's completely available for anyone to look at, translated in 50 different languages, that really lay out all the considerations we're talking about here and gives targeted learning modules for mining sector professionals, both from governments and industry, to walk through the different ways that you actually start doing that capacity development on the ground. So there are modules on resource management, project development, production, and stewardship, with work available on social license to operate. How do you actually develop workforce development programs in country? How do you work with indigenous communities and sustainable infrastructure investments? This has really been the cornerstone of how we got started. As we continued our work and we found ourselves in the moment of the last 2 or so years, there's a lot of things that have shifted, both in our own policy, but really in the global economy. One, we saw, led very much by the US and other really important partners, a real response to addressing the climate crisis. And that commitment, both from new NDCs and the IRA and all the things we'll talk about later in this conversation, really is creating an important demand push to ensure that we're getting these technologies right on the front end and getting them deployed to market. At the same time, as someone who sits in our Energy Bureau, I'd be remiss to not reference the global energy crisis we find ourselves in right now, and all the work that we're doing to manage supply today, while ensuring we're doing everything we can do to not find ourselves in this situation for future technologies, which requires a lot more than just securing these supply chains, but doing so in a way that really supports the economic development and growth of all economies involved, including those, as you mentioned, Sharon, that have some of these resources that can't be found anywhere else. When we were thinking about how do we engage in a more fast response, near-term way, because I think everyone in this line is fully aware of some of the challenges and opportunities in this sector, including how long it really takes to site out a mining project and a processing project, and how soon we know we're going to need these materials in all our markets to be able for companies like Ford to meet their goals and all of us here, that we needed to do more work to support near-term commercial opportunities or near commercial opportunities in the production and processing capabilities. And that's really how the Mineral Security Partnership was born. So in June, the State Department, in partnership with 10 other governments, including but not limited to Australia, Canada, Japan, the Republic of Korea, the European Union, and several European countries banded together to work out a process to help us, in practical terms, start diversifying clean energy supply chains. And since June, we've been working on putting together different opportunity sets, working with producing countries, working with industry, to find tangible ways that we can start attracting public and private investment to increase the transparency and promote the highest ESG standards throughout the critical mineral supply chain. And we actually had spent the whole summer together working on identifying where some of these projects can be, both within, but really outside of the jurisdictions of our partnership, and started developing ways that we can take advantage of existing ESG criteria to ensure that we are able to have a coherent and clear message to countries about, and companies, about what it means to uphold these standards. So taking advantage of some of the work that IRMA's done and many other organizations to ensure that we are able to really have clear conversations with investors and operators around the world. I'm delighted to say that just a week ago, on the margins of the UN General Assembly, Secretary Blinken, in partnership with MSP partners and several countries from some of these producing regions, including the DRC, Zambia, and many, many others, Tanzania as well, joined us to have really a conversation about what's next. This was a chance for foreign ministers and high-level officials to really talk through the challenges and how you manage the value proposition around investments in countries that really uphold all these elements, but also need to move at the speed that we're seeking, not just as consumers of these products, but for the governments that are seeking this investment. And a lot of really important themes came up that I hope we touch on a little bit today. Many of the countries we spoke with really laid out the value proposition of what they're trying to consider. They want to make sure that they have a true understanding of their resource base. So they understand as they tender out projects or start making modifications to their royalty or tax regimes, that they're doing so in a way that totally serves their community. They want to see their own leadership participating in these projects, whether it's locally hired geologists or the ability to bring value-added industries, whether that's near-term processing, and that's kind of different for each of the commodities we're talking about, or in some cases, the ability to do some precursor work for the cathode and anode material. So there's a lot of really interesting opportunities here that I think create win-win situations for the whole global community that are participating in these issues. And we're really excited as a partnership to move MSP into the next phase as we start working in closer coordination with our partners around the world.
Thank you, Helena. That's great. And, you know, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, you know, part of how we got to the circumstances that we're in today, where there's a few countries, you know, China being the main one, that disproportionately dominate the global critical minerals trade, you know, was partly because of differences in environmental standards and social and governance standards, and that some of the other companies in the West complained that they could never match their competitors because they were being held to a higher standard. But it sounds to me like what you're talking about with this mineral security partnership, which is so interesting because it's both producers and consumers together, is using ESG and standards as an advantage and as a comparative advantage, a competitive advantage against other national companies and others that maybe don't adhere to the same standards. Is that fair to say? That's sort of one of the themes I thought I was hearing in what you were saying.
Yeah, I think there's a couple elements to this. So one, for all the reasons we've been talking about here, not only consumers, but countries that are developing these sectors on the production and processing side are increasingly becoming more aware of the benefits of considering ESG standards on the front end for every reason we talked about here. But to do that in a meaningful way, there needs to be a way to translate that into projects moving at the speed and scope that both sides want. And so I think taking an effort to do some of the work and bring the work that Irma and others are doing to the table in a clear way that makes sense to policymakers and demonstrates the representation of views of several governments at the same time has a value. The other piece is what we can do together is better than what we can do alone. So every country that's part of the partnership formally have different comparative advantages on how we can help either de-risk projects or bring advocacy to projects or work through opportunities for offtake. So together, it's a better opportunity to have that conversation with a potential producing country that has been laying out all of these additional features that they want to ensure, very rightfully so, are part of their mining sector development. So I think it's all those pieces married together that we think will make this partnership quite successful.
Thanks, Helena. I want to go back and engage all of our panelists again, and also just to, certainly offer to our panelists, you are also allowed to comment on each other's comments and to direct questions to each other if you like. I know it's difficult when we're all on in the virtual environment, but feel free. You don't have to only answer the questions I ask, and we will turn to the audience in a minute. But Amy, I wanted to go back to to you and everything you've just heard, and then also sort of the pin that I left you with, which is there may be in a lot of communities a lot of skepticism about the companies and about mining. Given some of the history there, what do you think about that, and whether or not the mining companies and throughout the whole value chain for mining can be good partners? Are you seeing that as part of your work?
I definitely am seeing a shift. It's not a wholesale shift yet, but that's why we need to keep pressing through on this. I mean, the entry of Ford and 5 other car makers alongside wind and tech and jewelry have really helped to change the whole conversation. I mean, we started the work on Irma 15 years ago with an initial focus on jewelry, but you're really only hearing Irma's name in the last couple of years. That's really because of energy transition and how much the auto sector in particular, but wind, tech, others have really brought attention to the materials associated with energy transition and the irony if we are causing greater harm at the top of the supply chain. So their interest and their levering has really shifted things. So we do have companies like Anglo American saying they'll be audited at all their mine sites. And we have smaller companies, whether that's Carrizal in Mexico or Albemarle and others who are still willing to do this, even though they're smaller companies. I think you're absolutely right that there is this tremendous distrust out there still of affected communities. You're not going to take 100 years of harm and inequity and just wave a wand and say, promise we'll do it better. We need some real examples of that happening going forward. And I think, what I'll frequently say, I mean, we can't just fast track this moment. The best way, if you want it happening faster, is to, as Amayel said, is to get in and work directly with communities, because without community consent, we do not have security of supply. It's as simple as that. We're not going to waive a bunch of social and environmental laws, whether that's in the US or in the DRC or Indonesia, and say, we're just going to get these materials. That lack of community consent is going to be a lack of security of supply. And we absolutely must go forward with the idea of, can we do better benefit sharing, and can we do this industry in a less destructive way?
Sorry to be distracted, but I wanted to actually tweet what you just said because I thought it was so important. And I won't. So anyway, that's what I was looking away from, just about that we don't have security of supply without community consent. And Amayel, you talked about that a lot in your comments, given that that is your daily labor. But you also mentioned artisanal mining, which I know is a big thing in the DRC. And that artisanal mining and industrial scale mining are two very different contexts, and they have their own risks and their own considerations. So could you just push down a little bit? I was going to say drill down, but that would be the wrong metaphor. What are the opportunities and challenges for better mining across artisanal and industrial mining, and how do they differ? What's the difference here? If you could kind of list that out for us and talk a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Sharon. I think that I'm more of a specialist of ASM than LSM. So I will start focusing on ASM if it's fine with you. But first of all, we're talking about ASM, but I'm not sure if everybody knows what ASM is and also what is the proportion of ASM miners. So basically, ASM includes mining operations with simplified forms of exploration, extraction, and processing. And it is low capital intensive, but extremely high labor intensive. And there's about 45 million ASM operators working in 80 countries. And here it's only those who are working directly in ASM, meaning that, for every one person working directly in the ASM, there's about also 6 other people who are also benefiting from it because they are implementing, other side businesses. And so there's about 30 to 40% women who are those ASM operators. And one of the things also, which is extremely important here, is that about 80 to 90% of ASM operations are taking place in the informal sector. And so when we're talking about challenges, from what we've seen on the ground, because we've been working with ASM communities for several decades now, in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. And also from the different research that we've seen, I would say that there's maybe 5 main challenges that they are faced with. So first of all, informality, as I was saying earlier on, and this is mainly due to lack of legislation. Then there's also the lack of investment in equipment, not only to increase production, but also to increase the safety of mining operations. There's also a bit of lack of expertise, regarding, for instance, how to find a vein, how to dig a tunnel safely. And there's also a lack of markets sometimes where, for them to be able to sell their goods at a fair price. We're talking a lot about Chinese in this conversation, and what I recall, for instance, from the last trip that I took in the DRC and in the cobalt hub, Kolwezi, was really having like all of those, like on one of the roads leading to Kolwezi, there was all of those Chinese traders that were there, and basically they were kind of like the only ones that were there for ASM miners to be able, to sell their products. And when you're talking about standards, earlier on in the conversations, I do remember that they didn't really care, whether it was children who had been mining the products or not. And then the last challenge, which is also something that people don't often talk about, but because I'm a woman, I'm going to talk about it. It's also, those gender perceptions, which negatively impact on women. So, for instance, there are really a limit regarding the kind of jobs that women do in this ASM field. And often there will be the washers or the panners, or they will be the ones transporting the minerals. But those jobs obviously are not the ones that are, where you get the best salary. The second thing also is that there's many myths, apologies for the accent, but I think you see what I mean, that women are confronted to. And, for instance, again, in the DRC, apologies, I was taking these kind of examples, but women are often banned from mining sites because men think that if a woman has her periods and enters on the mining site, then the mining vein will disappear. So they really have, all of those different things that need to, to contend with. However, there are some opportunities that I feel that, we should definitely leverage. And those include the increasing awareness that ASM operators are the world's hidden suppliers, to quote one of my colleagues. And basically, they only produce 10% of the total mineral production throughout the world. However, they represent about 90% of this workforce. And for instance, they produce between 20 to 25% of the gold. They produce 30% of the tin. They produce between 18 to 30% of cobalt also, depending on the sources. So they are quite important. And, as you were saying earlier that, we can't do this green transition without the DRC, I would also say that, we can't do them without the ASM operators. And then the second opportunity I think that we should definitely leverage is also the increasing number of legislations which are being enacted now and which are compelling downstream companies, such as Ford, for instance, to improve their due diligence system, and to really know all of the different suppliers who are there, and where they themselves also getting their material from. And this started about a decade ago with Dodd-Frank. That was really focusing on 3TG. But now we're seeing new legislation enacted in the UK, in France, in Japan, soon with the European Union. So I feel that all of those really are opportunities for upstream and downstream companies, really just to make sure that they know their supply chain, that they apply this due diligence, and that they know that whatever product they are putting in their end-line product, that everything is clean. I'm not sure if I've answered all of the questions.
No, that was great. In fact, again, some indelible words and images that you conveyed there. One is certainly the magisterial power of a menstruating woman over mining. I will stick with me for a while, but also the image of Chinese traders on the road, right? They're there. So, that's been a problem all along, is that, American companies or the American government may say, we don't like the standards or the way they're doing things, but they're there. And they're giving money to the local community, and that, that beats an empty hand. And you also mentioned legislation in so many countries, and that gives me a perfect segue to turn back to Chris Smith and to Helena Matzah, because the United States government also has been, the Biden administration has just been a wellspring of new policy, and the Congress has been passing new legislation. And I wonder, both of you, if you could talk about some of the latest developments. Chris, the Inflation Reduction Act had some language specifically about critical mineral benchmarks in the electric vehicle, consumer tax credit, all the incentives there. So could you talk about the way tax credits, the Defense Production Act, the Innovative Technologies Loan Guarantee Program, what are the programs there that are changing the way, first of all, your industry, automakers, are looking at sourcing locations and mining partners? And then Helena, I'd like to turn to you to see if there's anything else that you want to highlight that the administration, because there's so much going on, it's hard to keep track. So Chris, how are these things changing the way you're approaching this?
Thanks, Sharon. So the Inflation Reduction Act it's incredibly aggressive and incredibly aggressive piece of legislation in terms of advancing funding for clean energy technologies, including technologies important for the future transportation, particularly electrical vehicles. So there's a credit which the Inflation Reduction Act offers for consumers, a consumer tax credit. It's a $7,500 credit. It's cut into two pieces. One for the manufacturing of the battery that goes into the electric vehicles, and the second half of that is for the procurement of the minerals that go within the batteries. And so in order to qualify for that mineral component, the batteries have to include a certain percentage of minerals that are either extracted or refined, either in the United States or in a country with which the United States have a free trade agreement. And so this is, one of the intents of this legislation, is to nearshore, to friendshore, to onshore some of these pieces of the supply chain for a couple of reasons. First, as we move to electrification and manufacture batteries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and power our economy, the United States also, the government feels like it should have a greater direct role in overseeing and managing the environmental issues that are associated with the extraction and the processing of said minerals. And so the idea is to move those minerals from other countries back to the United States or to countries with which the United States has a free trade agreement. The targets that the legislation sets are very aggressive. As we've mentioned earlier in the conversation, China particularly has a multi-decade lead on the rest of the world in terms of extracting and processing. And in many cases, these are issues. These are facilities or processes which we desire to move to the United States if possible. So in order to comply with that legislation, companies like Ford are looking at domestic opportunities. Just recently, we're looking at opportunities in Nevada, in Utah, and Louisiana for lithium and for graphite. As you know, these are long lead time activities. You can't do these things quickly. We think you can do them, however, more quickly than we currently are doing. So one of the things that we've done is engage with the Department of the Interior and encouraging the Department of the Interior to look at ways to streamline these processes, which we think we can do, and at the same time respect and be compliant with the letter and the spirit of all the environmental regulations that would make sure that these practices are done in a way that's safe and consistent with our overall environmental values. But in totality, we think that we should be able to do these, do this as effectively and as safely in the United States as we can in any other part of the world. I think that's probably a competitive advantage of the United States. But we need to make sure that the permitting process actually allows us to do these things, to move projects forward, as Lauren mentioned in her introduction, not mining is not an option. It's a question of where we will do these things. If we're going to use electric vehicles in order to move our economy, to create jobs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have to come up with a good solution for where these materials are going to be coming from.
And Helena, before you answer the broad question, I just want to say that we're getting lots of really excellent audience questions. So I want to tag on to what I asked you, a question from Jeff Colgan at Brown University. He pointed out that the Canada Institute is one of the co-sponsors of this event. So as you answer that question, could you add on to it the challenges the U.S. government is working to address with Canadians to provide minerals for the clean energy transition? I know you're working a lot on that, and they're a really important partner. So as you talk about what the U.S. government is doing that's new, it would be great if you could add that into your response.
Sure, happy to do so. So as Chris very, very well put, you think you would work for the U.S. government as well. A really great explanation of what the IRA is doing and really the anticipated impact. I'd be remiss to not say that this is truly an historic piece of legislation. We're talking about over almost $370 billion of investment in clean energy and tech. So much of it on the production side that can help capitalize trillions of dollars in investment that is going to reach far beyond our borders. So it's an incredibly exciting moment that's really building on the work that happened earlier in this administration with the bipartisan infrastructure law that put a huge cash infusion, not only into EV charging infrastructures, but to rare earth processing. And one of the really exciting pieces of the IRA is the additional loan guarantee authorities that have been given to DOE, or should not say new authorities, but amount of funding, many of it already being put into the critical mineral and battery processing space, with just earlier this summer, an over $100 million loan for the first graphite processing in Louisiana outside of the current supply chain. So really exciting investments. As Chris laid out, there are elements to how critical minerals and EV battery production and assembly are going to be developed. Right now, the U.S. government is actively working through the process of developing the rulemaking of exactly how we will implement those various elements of the legislation. And the State Department has been very actively working closely with our trusted trading partners to figure out all the different ways that we can do everything we can to expedite what Chris very accurately laid out, which is ensuring that we're able to meet these ambitious timelines. So I think there's tons of enthusiasm within our government there's lots of work happening outside that the State Department and others are engaging on with foreign partners. In regard to the broader kind of ecosystem, in addition to the work that's happening now with this new legislation, which is really just unbelievable across the whole clean tech sector, even beyond EVs. We've been working through the MSP, through ERGI, and through our various different critical mineral dialogues, including our joint action plan with the government of Canada, to really ensure that we're doing everything we can to help incentivize the North American supply chain. And the government of Canada and Canadian industry have been incredibly close allies in the development of how we're starting to get creative in this space. And we're seeing some really interesting things happen. Lots of new novel technology that is coming out that is really focused on, processing cathodes in ways that we've never seen before, that can actually bring some of that capacity back to North America, whether that's in Canada or the US, or new types of extraction technologies coming from US industry that's being used in countries like Argentina that allow us to look through ways to extract lithium brine without using evaporation ponds. So it's a really exciting, evolving market that I think is going to give us space, not just on the incentive side, but also on the innovation side, to really start reorienting these supply chains as they're going to shift in real time. So it's a really exciting moment, I think, for the US, but for anyone who wants to see this work happen and us reach our climate goals.
Thank you. And I have to say, both of you, I really appreciate your response there. We have so many great questions and so little time left that I'm almost not sure what to do. So I'm hoping that there might be a way for Lauren Reese and her colleagues to actually help get some answers to all of these questions, because I think they're really important and excellent questions. So just for our listeners, if I don't get to you, we're going to see if there's another way we can get these questions answered, because I'm like stunned at the quality. So I'm going to try to quickly field a couple. Amy, actually a colleague of Amaya's, Cristina Villegas, the director of responsible mining at PACT, posed a really good question for Amy, which is, have major mining companies in DRC's copper belt joined IRMA, and why or why not? And how can industry or others encourage more companies to join meaningful, responsible mining initiatives like IRMA?
Great question from Christina, as always. They have not joined in terms of starting independent audits. There are companies in the DRC who are using our self-assessment tool, which they can use confidentially, and exploring it out. I would love to see those companies move to the independent audit phase, which is where we need them. I think that if I step into their shoes, they are daunted to talk frankly with the level of transparency that IRMA asks for about the challenges they face in the DRC. But others have said here, with the amount of cobalt coming from the DRC and the implications on the globe of our sourcing there, and the potential for it to be the resource curse and the opportunity to reverse that curse, as Amayel and Christina are frequently working toward, I think it's such an opportunity moment for them to come in and talk about, contextualize what we're already saying here transparently, right? Which is that the world is aware, right? As long as we have these things, right? It's not unknown to the world already. So let's talk about the challenges that are operating in the DRC and those who want to differentiate themselves for improving those practices. We know that the context is broader than just mining, the challenge is broader than mining, but they could lead even in a difficult context. And I think that I would so welcome them doing that, but not yet is the answer to that.
Okay, God, there's so many good questions. And Amayel, I'm going to be coming to you with the whopper of a question, probably at the very end. So brace yourself for that. It's mysterious, but it's more about how do people do the right thing at a consumer level. But before we get there, Bob Barnes from the Council on Strategic Risk asked an interesting question about deep seabed mining, which is something that hasn't really been technically feasible until fairly recently, and still some debate about whether it is. A lot lots of companies say they can do it economically. So is that fit in the purview for any of you for your activities? Are you looking at that and all the ESG considerations? And that doesn't have to be a long answer. I think it's just an interesting question, whether it's on the table for you. Amy, you're nodding.
Well, I'll say first that we've just said at this point that the IRMA standard can't be applied to deep sea mining yet. I think there is a sense that it's not that mining on land is decidedly less impacting. It's just that with everything we don't know yet about the sea and everything that we do know about the deep sea and how fragile it is and how much oceans are under stress right now, adding industrial extraction to that space until we have the governance structures and a standard that can really deal with that feels like a risk that we don't need to take as the same moment that we're trying to drive innovation that really reduces harm. And so the IRMA standard isn't applied there yet, but I'd be interested in if others want to contribute to their interest or lack thereof on deep sea.
Helena, I can see you unmuted.
Yeah, you know, I think that this is a really interesting question and one that we are very much trying to educate ourselves on here in the US government for very similar reasons that Amy identified. You know, I always talk about trying to walk while chewing gum, but I don't know if we can full on sprint. So I would say much of the USG is still in education mode. I know some of my colleagues that spend more time on the assistance side have maybe made it a couple more steps, but we're interested in seeing how the industry evolves and how standards come around, some of the work that we're learning as companies are getting out there and piloting this technology.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, given that the current governance mechanism is a somewhat obscure element from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which of course the US is not party to. Chris, you got a question from Melanie de Vincentis, Sustainability ASG, which I think is Albright Stonebridge Group. It says, Chris, EVs do require a much larger number of semiconductor chips than fossil fueled cars. After the CHIPS Act, do you foresee a short-term limitation in EV production capacity, given the current limits of semiconductor production capacity? So not exactly a critical minerals question, but it is a supply chain question and it all fits together. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, very much a supply chain question, right? So, you know, it links back to the way that we're thinking about, you know, the new complex about building all of these, the new generation of vehicles. So, so we're in the middle of a shortage of semiconductors, as many of the viewers here will be aware. So we're down a significant number of vehicles since the beginning of that shortage that was driven by the pandemic, driven by, you know, a fragile supply chain and a very thin surplus of semiconductors. And so, you know, every day, you know, through this period, our plants have had to make decisions about what vehicles they make, what vehicles they don't make. In some cases, you can manufacture a vehicle, park it somewhere, and then take that component that requires a semiconductor and retrofit it afterwards. So that's a you know, dramatically suboptimal way of building cars, but one that's become necessary because of the shortage of semiconductors. The CHIPS Act helps because you know, for two reasons. First, it drives funding into the companies that want to put capital into building facilities to manufacture semiconductors. Also, it helps the supply chain because the driver of chips is to build more plants here domestically in the United States, and so it helps make that supply chain more resilient for American companies. Now that relief comes, you know, in the future, right? Because the funds have to be allocated, final investment decisions have to be made, facilities have to be built, and then eventually you have a suite of chips that can be used for applications like ours. So there's a short-term issue about supply of chips that won't necessarily be alleviated by the CHIPS Act, but certainly the CHIPS Act, I think, is an important issue for the U.S. economy, for national security, because supply chains are very important for national security, and applications from computers to handheld electronics to the Department of Defense all use chips. They're an incredibly important part of the ecosystem of our supply chain.
Thank you, Chris. A thought-provoking answer. So I want to give the last time here, at least to Amaya, if you choose to answer this question. I'm going to bundle a few questions. But before I do, Helena, I just want you to know, so that you can bank this and take it away with you, that there were a number of questions about the Minerals Security Partnership, about how it's going to work in practice, how are you going to ensure compliance with ESG standards, and then also a really interesting question that was from Nicholas Cook from the Congressional Research Service, from Fabian Villalobos from the RAND Corporation. He was saying includes much of U.S. traditional allies and partners in the MSP, but what about non-traditional partners who may be more integral to the supply chain? Think about those for a minute, but Amaya, and if we don't get a chance to answer them, if you have a chance to filter back to us, and we can let you know what else people ask, but just so you know, lots of interest in it and what the whole span of it's going to be. But Amaya, we got a series of really interesting questions. One from Don Greenwood, who's a retired architect, and Jed Cobalt with the Presbyterian Church, about, it's a really interesting set of questions about what can the average American do to help advance best practices in responsible mining? How do we help promote equitable treatment of indigenous people and protect the environment, improve economic situations? And Jed asked, are end brands and others through the supply chain using their leverage and in making sure that there's informed consent? How can consumers hold them accountable? And we also had David from a strategic planner from the DoD said, how do we improve programming to advance gender equality and inclusive employment? So, and I think that those were all spurred certainly in large measure by what you had to say. Do you have any advice, any comments, any thoughts on that?
Yes, thanks. First of all, I don't think I'll be able to answer all of the questions, but I will be happy if you can send them to me over, and I could provide responses, and then they could be posted on the website. I think that to start with the first question, for the average American or French person or just the average person, I think there's a few things that can be done. First of all, I want to say, read companies' ESG reports. You will learn a lot about what is going on there, about what they're doing, who they're partnering with, and chances are that if they are partnering with organizations such as PACT or other organizations, but who are on the ground, who are working towards this kind of goal, then it's okay. You can consume from them, and that's good. That's the first thing. The second thing, it's also if there's petitions, sign them, because if it's about subject matters that are important to you, pressure the local, your local government representative as well, so they can also help change things. Show your discontent regarding these kind of things. I'm really sorry, apologies. I have a baby coming. It's
Never apologize for babies.
No, it's okay.
Don't apologize for babies. That's right.
Sorry, I forgot the second question.
Again, it was all about how do we take responsibility as individual consumers, but we also had someone from the U.S. Department of Defense saying, we are compelled by law to better incorporate gender and women. And you had mentioned that very specifically. Is that encouraging to you to hear that kind of question from a U.S. government official?
Yes, definitely. And I think that there's a number of things that can be done, just to ensure that, for instance, for the example that I provided, it's important to debunk these kind of myths. It's important to make sure that people, understand that women are just equal as as men, and that this really needs to be promoted not only for this kind of work, but just in everyday situation as well. We need to make sure that we understand the environment in which we're working. We need to understand those local myths or perceptions, why they exist and how we can also change them. We need to work with those local leaders who are the ones that have this kind of power, and once you convince them and once they understand the issue, then they can also spread the word as well with the rest of the community members. We also need to make sure that girls have chances to go to school, so they can also get to these kind of jobs, and that they're not just the low paying jobs, but it's just like that they just have anyone else's opportunity. And I think that this is extremely important, not only in the DRC, but also in France where I'm living, or in the US as well. And I mean, this is something that exists everywhere, and that we should definitely make sure that we are aware of that, and that even at home, that these kind of things change. But I would be really happy to continue this conversation, responding to all of the questions that we got.
Thank you so much. And I wish we could go on, but we are actually at time. And I know all of our panelists today are busy people that are out getting this work done. So we're grateful to you for joining us. And this event was recorded and will be posted. It should be end of day or tomorrow available on the website. So we would encourage you to spread the word. And also there will be a blog post in the new security beat on the ECSP website that will encapsulate or summarize. And I can't speak for Lauren other than I'm watching her in the chat, that we will try to field some of the questions that we didn't get to. As I said, they were unusually high quality questions. So I thank the audience for engaging with us and for asking such good questions. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I know I did. And it was really a privilege to talk to all of you. Thank you to the Wilson Center, to the AV team that makes this easy, to Lauren for her leadership, and her colleagues, Amanda and Claire, who did a lot to put this together, and for Christy Bruckner for hanging out there and making sure, keeping us honest. To all of you panelists, to Chris, Amael, Amy, and to Helena, thanks for what you're doing and for talking to us about it today. Take care, everybody.